Hello, and welcome back to HMR 1, Section 1, Slavery, Lecture 3, the Sepulveda Las Casas debates. So the last lecture thought about the justifications for slavery and the creation of what in many ways forms the basis for a modern understanding of of racial hierarchy, of hierarchies between civilization and primitive, in fact, produces the underpinnings later for distinctions between races that are lighter skinned from races that are darker skinned. So this is important because this has helped shape not just the history of the Western Hemisphere, our hemisphere, but also discussions and debates about who is human. And that is one of the first questions we ask when we try to understand what human rights are, which is the notion of what makes us human. So I challenged you at the end of the last lecture to look at one another. I know that's very difficult on Zoom, especially when everyone has their screens turned off and we're social distancing, to look at one another, to think about what is it, at least superficially, that makes us human. I mean, we have hair. I'm looking at my son Aram over there. We both have eyes. We have noses. But, beyond that, how do I know he's human? What is it about him that I know that makes him human? Well, he's wearing clothes, right? He's sitting in a chair. He's also using technology, right? Which means he's using tools. So as we look at other people, we can either choose to emphasize what's different or choose to emphasize what's similar to understanding the basis of humanity. But one of the core ideas about what makes someone human, and this is something that has populated discussions about humanity from the early modern period until today, is this question of reason. That the human is the animal that reasons, and I will challenge that notion, but that the human is the animal that reasons, that can think, that can gather evidence, that can make a decision. The human is possessed of reason and dignity, and that is at the core of our humanity. So that was very important for early modern thinkers in terms of understanding whether or not the indigenous peoples of the New World were in fact human beings. Because if they weren't human beings, then law and morality didn't necessarily apply to them. And so they could be treated as not quite humans. So this question forms the very basis of what's called the Valladolid debates of the 1550s. And at the core of those debates are three men. The third is not up here. And again, we'll take a picture of the chalkboard here to outline the two main characters in this. One is Juan Gines de Sepulveda, and Sepulveda lived from 1494 to 1573. Sepulveda was a humanist philosopher of Spanish origin, right? He was a Spanish philosopher who wrote primarily about law and legal thinking. He was a great disciple of Aristotle and Plato, which probably tells you where he would side in debates about slavery. And opposing him is a very interesting and compelling figure, probably one of the Western Hemisphere's first European human rights defenders, a man by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas. De las Casas, or Las Casas, lived from 1484 to 1566. And just think about those dates for a moment. These dates straddle, if you will, the European discovery of the New World in 1492. So these two men really are in the first generation of Europeans who grew up being aware of the New World. And the third figure that comes into this is King Carlos, or King Charles V of Spain, who was a long living monarch who really saw himself as a great sponsor of the arts and of culture, and presided over the growth of New Spain, meaning the Spanish holdings in the New World, the greatest growth of that, and the establishment of one of the largest empires in the history of humanity. So De Las Casas began life, he was 18 years old. He was the younger son of a Spanish noble. And in that period, if you were a younger son, according to the rules of primogeniture, when your father croaked, you got nothing. It all went to your big brother. So he was well educated. He was trained to fight. He had a horse. And instead of staying in Spain in relative poverty and obscurity, he did what many other young Iberian men did in that period. He traveled to the New World as a conquistador, as a conqueror, someone who went with a group of other military men to an unconquered or unsettled, in both cases they were already settled, mostly, and they would go and they would subdue the indigenous inhabitants, murder large numbers of them, take over the land, and establish settlements. And so that's what De Las Casas did. He leaves Seville, and travels to New Spain in 1499, and he to the Caribbean island of Hispaniola. And Hispaniola, which is now divided between two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And we'll actually get to Haiti again in a few weeks. And so the island was already inhabited by indigenous peoples, right? And these peoples had resisted occupation by the Europeans, and Las Casas and the men and women who traveled with him engaged in warfare against the indigenous people, subdued them, and enslaved them. And as part of that process, Las Casas was given what was called in those days an encomienda, which is a form of sort of it's like you receive a plot of land, and then in order to cultivate it and develop it, the state gives you slaves. And in this case, the enslaved people were the conquered Indians of Hispaniola. And so an encomienda is in many ways enslavement of entire communities at the service, if you will, of in this case, a Spanish lord. And in many ways, in California, we have experienced something very similar in the Spanish missions, both in terms of form and function, where indigenous Californian peoples were enslaved by the Spanish crown to work for the Spanish friars. And so, from San Diego to Solano, entire communities of indigenous people were enslaved. So during this period, the youngish Las Casas, by all accounts, he was very, very smart, but also very sensitive. He witnessed a terrible massacre of indigenous people. I think it was on Cuba, not on Hispaniola. And this led to a real crisis of conscience on his part, where he thought, this really isn't what I, as a good person, as a good Christian, should really be part of. So he returned to Spain in 1514, renounced his property, and began to preach against the subjugation of native peoples. He was ordained a priest and, in fact, studied for it at a university, and began to sort of write letters and public statements and what we now call articles, saying things like everything perpetrated on the Indians in the Indies, meaning the indigenous inhabitants in the West Indies, meaning the New World, was, quote, unjust and tyrannical. And to address this, he returned to New Spain, and in Venezuela set up a kind of colony of farm communities, which was made up of sort of lower class Spaniards and indigenous peoples. And they tried to live together as equals in a kind of an interesting communal work-life environment that was actually very attractive. And increasingly what was happening was enslaved indigenous people were escaping from encomienda in Venezuela and making their way to where Las Casas was to seek refuge and asylum because life there was much better than they were experiencing. And so the colonial elite, the landlords, the holders of these territories complained bitterly to the King of Spain, and this brought Las Casas and his ideas to his attention. So in 1550, King Charles of Spain, ordered Las Casas to come to him in Spain and make his case on behalf of the Indians. So, one of the styles of argument that was often used at courts, not law courts, but it's similar, was a kind of oppositional process where you had a proponent of idea and an opponent of idea. And they would argue in public in front of the king and his court. And then eventually the king would come to a decision. And on the one side of this argument, King Carlos asked Sepulveda to take the stand that the Indians were not quite human, they could be enslaved, and that they were, sort of, the way that they were being treated was not unjust or wrong. That current Spanish policy was okay. And then he told Las Casas to make his point, to argue on behalf of the Indians. So what I'm going to do now is juxtapose these two arguments, because this argument, the Sepulveda-Las Casas debate, was really the very first time that Europeans thought about the rights of indigenous people and began to think about, or at least conceptualize, the rights of others in terms of, began to conceptualize, I should sort of take a step back, began to conceptualize the fact that indigenous peoples have rights and what that actually means for them as colonizers. So this is a critical moment, not just in the history of colonialism, the history of genocide in the Western Hemisphere, but also those of us in human rights studies trace this consider this a very important first step in identifying the basis of the contemporary human rights idea. So, Sepulveda's main arguments are pretty much what you could predict. He argued that the wars made against the indigenous people who were being invaded, right? I mean, they didn't attack the Spanish, they were already there. That the wars against the Indians were justified as long as it was lawful and according to rules. And also, and here you'll hear echoes of Plato and Aristotle, the Indians are, quote, naturally inferior, submissive, and therefore are slaves by nature. Slaves by nature, right? And in fact, the wars being carried out against them are for their own good. They should be forced to submit to the control of those who are wiser, superior in virtue and learning, especially the nobility and the clergy, which, if we can imagine, were in fact the audience for Sepulveda in that moment, right? He knew how to play to his crowd, right? But also, when he tried to characterize the indigenous people, he called them, quote, those little men in whom one can scarcely find any remnants of humanity. As far as he was concerned, they had no science, no written laws. They had no private property ideas. They had none of the requirements of civilized society. And so therefore, it wasn't that the Spanish were making war not on behalf of Spain, but on their behalf, to bring them to civilization, to help them achieve to get their humanity. And in fact, if the Spanish didn't make war on them and bring them into the Spanish family, they would be doing them harm. Right? This was the argument, right? in order to save them, we had to kill them, right? So he also goes on to explain that Indians commit cannibalism, human sacrifice, right? And they're not enforcing any laws against this, so these are unnatural acts and inhuman, and so the Spanish have to do something about it. And moreover, that conquest is important because it's justified, because ultimately you're bringing people to Christianity, and that's the most important thing. He also, when confronted with when they arrive in the New World, the Spanish are confronted by people who built pyramids, enormous cities with great agriculture and art. And in fact, they used evidence. Both Sepulveda and Las Casas pointed to the Mendoza Codex, which we looked at earlier, and you'll have a chance to look at, I hope, with your TAs in section. They used this same image, which we're showing you on Slack, this same image of a pyramid near Mexico City, in which you could see a pyramid, but you also see what is happening. A blood sacrifice is taking place. So on one hand, you could argue, look, you can't say these people have no civilization. They built pyramids, right? And no one was arguing that space aliens or dinosaurs were doing it for them. They built these pyramids. I mean, that would be the argument for their civility, for their civilization. But then if you look at what's happening in the image, they're cutting the heart out of a sacrificial victim. So it could be evidence used. The image itself also points to evidence, at least from the Spanish perspective, of barbarism. So these were pretty, he concludes his argument with one of the most famous and most ugly statements ever made in history, which is, quote, the indigenous people, the Indians, as he would say, are inferior to the Spaniards just as children are to adults, women to men, and indeed, one might say, as apes are to men, unquote. Now, I mean, these were powerful arguments, right? These were very persuasive arguments, and it seemed to fit with what the Spanish had encountered in the New World. These were people they didn't understand. They didn't speak any of the languages that they knew. They didn't have a written language, at least a written language they understood. They didn't practice Christianity. They did things which they found abominable, including cannibalism and human sacrifice, right? So Las Casas gets up, right? And Las Casas is not as eloquent or as flowery as Sepulveda. He's there in the very simple outfit of a monk. He's got his head shaven in a tonsure, and he gets up and he makes a series of arguments to rebut Sepulveda. The first thing he argues is that the Indians look like human beings. They have 2 arms, 2 legs, eyes, noses. They walk upright like we do, and thus they are created in God's image. And as a consequence, they are like all the other peoples of the world, and that they possess what he calls natural rights, including the right to liberty. In other words, that human beings, by their very nature, seek out freedom, right? And because of this, Indians should not be enslaved, right? Indians should not be enslaved. And in fact, his next point of his argument is that Indians' natural society and customs, no matter how horrible, express a desire for the good, right? And even though they might practice cannibalism and human sacrifice, these are things that don't necessarily justify war, right? And moreover, he would argue that cannibalism and human sacrifice are part of their law, and it's part of their native culture. It's part of what they do. And he's saying you can't argue that these people don't have civilization and law just because they practice cannibalism, if in fact these forms of ritual cannibalism are part of their law. And then he goes on to make an argument which I'm sure raised a few eyebrows at court, which is that there are episodes even in the Bible, the Hebrew scripture and the New Testament of the Christians, that God does not necessarily find human sacrifice wrong, including the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? And that even offering one's sacrifice to God, even offering one's sacrifice to God is seen as being noble. He also argued that in times of extremists, Europeans have practiced cannibalism, and argued, in fact, that the central ritual of Christianity is an act of drinking the blood and eating the flesh of Christ. And finally, that the Indians, the indigenous people, have an inborn sense of belief in a supreme being, which he argued was their understanding of God. So Las Casas debate is very interesting, and I think it's something that we should think about, because it was an argument not based on the theories of some ancient Greek philosopher, but rather on the observation of the way people were living, but also willingness to accept the possibility of difference, that we could encounter people whose ways are different, but that doesn't mean they are less human, right? And I don't like to use the word tolerance, because that's not what's happening here. It's an acknowledgement that different peoples under different circumstances seek out solutions to their problems and celebrate their achievements in different ways. And it was also humane, because at the center of Las Casas' idea was that the indigenous people are humans, all men are brothers, and therefore they have natural rights, but they also have responsibility to one another. So at this point, during a live lecture, I would turn to the 250 of you out in the audience and I would say, so who won? Las Casas or Sepulveda? Who won, Aram? Las Casas or Sepulveda? Just guess one. I don't know. Okay, Aram doesn't know. All right, he's helping me film today. Most of them argue that Sepulveda won, right? I mean, he was representing the powerful, the people with the moneyed interests, if you will, the people most associated with the crown and with power. Whereas, who was Las Casas representing? He was representing Indians, the oppressed people. But that's not how it turned out. Las Casas won the debate. He won the debate. And it manifested in what was called the Spanish New Laws. The King of Spain ordered a halt to all wars against the Indian peoples. He also ordered that all enslaved Indians be released, that Indian slavery was illegal, right? And that indigenous peoples should never be forced to convert. Rather, should be converted in other ways. But you've heard the expression to win a battle but lose a war. Well, in this case, Las Casas won the debate, but Sepulveda won the larger conquest. The king may have ordered wars to stop, but wars continued, and indigenous people maybe were no longer enslaved, but by the time this law began to go into effect, the numbers of indigenous peoples in the areas under Spanish control had dropped so severely because of genocide and other economic and environmental practices that indigenous peoples as slaves no longer began to make any sense. In fact, Sepulveda becomes the great hero of later conquistadors, including those, especially those in what becomes Mexico in the 16th century, who were mounting genocidal campaigns in central and north central Mexico. It's important to remember that Peru and Venezuela and Mexico are a long way from Madrid and Spain. But Las Casas voiced a strong and bold defense of the right of indigenous people to be free. No one else had done that before. That's why this is important. And in fact, one of the premier human rights institutions in Mexico is named for him as well. And he used terms and ideas that we still use today. All men are brothers. We have the capacity to reason. These are critical and important concepts we'll continue to revisit throughout this course, and in fact, those words appear in critical human rights documents, including those that occurred 400 years later, most notably the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Thank you.